I'm pleased to introduce Aya Lurie, the Chief Curator and Director of Herzliya Museum of Contemporary Art in Israel. She was invited as a guest of our year-long program called Curating Institution, where we invited curators, directors of foreign and Polish institutions to discuss the matter of critical art institutions and critical approach to knowledge and art production. Tonight's talk is titled Nationality and Museology in the Context of Identity of Israel Art. Our guest, as I said, Aya Lurie, is Chief Curator and Director of Herzliya Museum of Contemporary Art in Israel, lecturer at the Academic College of Tel Aviv-Jaffa, in the program of Israel Art Studies. She holds the doctorate in art history from Tel Aviv University, and her doctoral dissertation was considered with representation of identity in local press state portraiture 1906-1948. So without further ado, welcome Aya. Thank you for being here, and I would like to as well thank you the Israel Embassy for significant help to make this meeting happen. And without further ado, the floor is yours. I wish you a pleasant lecture, and after the lecture you are welcome for the Q&A.
So, thank you so much for attending this evening. You're very brave, overcoming these big titles, nationality, identity, institutions, curatorial, museum, all those big names. And first I want to thank Malgorzata for such a warm and friendly welcome and invitation, and I hope we will continue to have this extremely warm and encouraging and deep, challenging dialogue. We just had the pleasure of hosting Malgorzata in Herzliya in Israel a few weeks ago, because Malgorzata was our guest. She will curator and a new art award that we are having at the Herzliya Museum of Contemporary Art. We are offering a guest curator to come and to meet 10 different young artists and to choose one of them, if they'll connect and fall in love with, of course, and curate the exhibition at the Herzliya Museum, and hopefully continue on, and invited him as well to his premises. And this dialogue is actually one of the main issues of the entire concept of museum, nationality, identity, structure that we will about to discuss today. And also I would like to thank dearly Konrad and the Israeli Embassy for supporting this, this conversation. And for us, this is a very unique day. I don't know if you know the day today, and so I think it will be the best way of talking about art and culture in artistic institution. And for me, it's even more meaningful today than in any other day, I have to say. So, talking about contemporary art, museums, nationality, identity, all those charged words, I was thinking about starting with history, because as an art historian, although dealing with contemporary art, I think that it's very important to reflect upon the past, the continuity and changes with those phrases, with those subject, the way that we judge the content of nationality, ideology, and the use of those terms inside the museum systems and its development. And let's start with this most important and iconic photograph. Every Israeli, of course, recognize it. I don't know if some of you are, but this is the declaration of the Israeli state. You could see David Ben-Gurion in the middle, and he's reading the declaration values, the declaration of the state. You could see up here is the portrait of Theodor Herzl. He's the prophet of the state. Himself was a journalist and a playwright, actually an artist, more or less, a visionary 19th century Hungarian Jew who actually had this vision that Jews need to have their own independent state, and not exactly fixed on the idea if it should be in Israel or Uganda, but nevertheless they needed one. And you can see that in 1948, half an hour after the last English soldier leaving the shores of Israel, the declaration took place, no more, no less, but in the building of the Tel Aviv Museum. And it's interesting to reflect upon the fact that the declaration of the state was actually happened in a museum institution. You can see here the building itself. It used to be the premises of the first mayor of Tel Aviv, Mayor Dizengoff, and he donated his private home to the city to establish a museum. Because being a good European bourgeois man, he thought that a good city, and a European and advanced city, need a museum in the center of it. And you have to understand that things that are so natural to you, born in Warsaw or in Poland or in Europe, to have palaces with fantastic treasures, belonging to royal families or belonging to the church, all of them are not common knowledge in Jewish tradition, in Jewish cities, in Jewish communities. I'm not talking only on the side that we are an immigration nation. I'm also talking about the fact that mostly Jews weren't involving in high artistic project. Of course, some of them did, but in an overall aspect. Another point that I want to state, considering the connection between nationality and museum, is, of course, now you can see the image of the Israel Museum. Most of you would recognize him as the encyclopedic museum of Israel. We have two big museums, the Tel Aviv Museum and the Israel Museum. But nevertheless, its name is the Israeli Museum. It's not declared as a national museum. And the former director, Dr. Martin Weil, actually fought many years to maintain this obscure definition of this museum, not to call it a national museum. Maybe because of those charged and complex ideas connected with nationality and museums. So I just want to indicate that the Israel Museum was open to the public on 1965, and you can see here the sketch of Al Mansfield when they thought about how this Israel Museum should look like, and you could see that they took their inspiration actually out of the topography of Arab villages, interact very naturally with the natural line of the hills, and it's rather raises all the complexity of the things, if you think that this is the source, the main source of the structure of the Israel Museum. But I wanted to focus on on 3 different constructions that are connected to museums in Israel. The Israel Museum, but we will explore the beginning, the pioneering stage of the Israel Museum, not the way that you know it today as a modern encyclopedic museum. I will talk a bit about En Harod, which is a museum that was established in a kibbutz, collective community, and I will finish with the Herzliya Museum, which is the museum I'm working at current time. So let's start with the beginners. And when we're talking about museums in Israel, we're usually talking about this phenomena of a crazy person, this mad person who has this visionary concept of establishing a museum. In this case, we are focusing on the figure of Boris Schatz. Boris Schatz was an artist, and his visionary of coming to Jerusalem on 1906 and to start this enterprise of Bezalel, the art academy that has also a museum with her, connected with her, was actually connected to the Zionist idea. You can see here, he also wrote a book. It's an utopian book, and in this utopian book you can see himself, Boris Schatz, and you can see the image of Bezalel, which is a biblical artist who constructed the temple in Jerusalem in the early days. And now you can see how he has this utopian idea, how with art he returns back to the lands of his fathers and mothers and establishing the state. And Boris Schatz met Theodor Herzl in Vienna before one of the Congress, the Zionist Congress there, and he managed to persuade him to have a financial support and to establish the High Art Academy of Bezalel in Jerusalem. And you have to understand that we are talking on a very, very early age. The country, the establishment of the country was only in 48, and we are now in 1903, now 1905, and those are very, very early stages of the Zionist idea being widespread. So the reason Boris Schatz, as you can see, in a very colonialist dressing outside this Jerusalem premises of the older Bezalel Academy, he was relying on the tendencies of 19th century nationality movements that happens around the world, and he was very much inspired by them. Actually, he was a guest of King Ferdinand, the Bulgarian king, that invited him to his court. He was his court artist. You could see him here. And he, with a group of artist friends, actually re-established again all the materialistic plastic heritage of Bulgarian identity as an independent nationality, because after years of Ottoman occupation, all those tendencies and senses was a bit assimilate and not disappeared, but should be revived again. And then Boris Schatz asked himself, why do I take such an active part in the establishment of the Bulgarian nation identity and self-identity, and what about my people that was, of course, spread around numerous countries, lack of any connection between one of them. They have different kind of nationalities, languages, aspect of what does it mean to be Jewish, other even ideas about how such a national ideas should be accomplished and executed. So he then turned to Herzl and managed, as I told you, to get funds. Always contemporary art or art is deeply connected with funds and with those who will believe that art would serve it to the best interest. So Boris Schatz found himself in Jerusalem, in a very Orthodox, undeveloped Oriental city, and dream of developing a new culture, a new plastic language, a new Hebrew language, but not only actual language, but also a plastic language. And you have to understand that he had to establish a completely new structure of visual elements to express these new ideas. So what he was doing is actually establishing a collections. This will be the base of the modern Israel museum collections. So he started first to collect works that was created by Jewish artists, of course. We could understand that move very easily, but also collecting some ethnographical objects that belong, some of them to Jews, but most of them to non-Jew inhabitants of Israel. Also collected some archaeological elements and plants, and also created a small zoo at the backyard of Bezalel. And one of the most, important and more direct act that he was doing was established a national portrait gallery. We all know the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery as two main instruments of constructing actually the face, the image of our nation. And to gather around her, to admire, to gain inspiration by. So who will inhabit the National Portrait Gallery of a dream, of a non-existing actual being, but a very rooted and sustained culture? So he put together all those kind of elements, those portraits that he was creating of Herzl, you can see here, but also of biblical prophets and of actual persons. And you can see that although in Europe art was very advanced and avant-garde, look, those elements were created around 1915, 1920. I mean, think about Cubism, think about abstract, think about whatever ism, Constructivism that you could think of, and that's what was happening in Jerusalem those days, very anachronistic. But if you think about the context of construction nationality, you could understand that he was seeking a new language, a new visual language. So taking actually inspiration from antique and Renaissance elements, putting the profile of Herzl with the image of Moses together with this plaque. It was for him the entire expression of re-establishing a new culture. So you will see there in the National Portrait Gallery Herzl, you would see Trumpeldor, which is one of the icons of the Jewish nation. He was a soldier, which was a completely new construction. He came from Russia. He knew how to hold a gun and knew how to dress with uniforms and defended this small place that he was placed in the north. And there's a big legend saying that his last words were, "Oh, how it is good to die for my land, for my country." Of course, today, contemporary, you know, those horrible contemporary historians said that he just cursed in Russia, and that sounds much more realistic to what he really did. And on the other side, you could see a portrait of Ben Yehuda. Ben Yehuda was he was an expert in linguistics, and he was actually collecting all the new words in Hebrew and re-establishing this language again, to have a language, a construction of the new nation to be. Another two demonstration that we would, of course, naturally will see in a National Portrait Museum. We'll see Echad Ha'am, a very deep intellectual who wrote about all the problematic elements of Zionism and the Jewish problem, and of course Abi Warburg. Now for you, Abi Warburg will be totally anonymous, but when I'm showing Israeli people in Israel, Warburg, it's not the Warburg that you think, it's another person by the same name, but this Warburg was in charge of the he was in charge of the money at the Zionist organization. That's why he was so important. And that's why he had this very respectable place in the National Portrait Gallery of Boris Schatz as well. So, Boris Schatz, as all prophets, hallucinating genius, crazy person, established and was able to establish his Bezalel Academy, his museum, but his fate was very, very tragic, and he found himself lost in piles of bureaucracy and Orthodox, a lot of statements that were going against his activity in Jerusalem, and he had also to raise a lot of funds to maintain the activity of the Bezalel Art Academy, and he finished his life in the mid-30s in the state trying to raise funds for his institution, sorry to say. Another example I want to show you on a different part of Israel, up in the north, we have another museum, art museum, that called Hamishkan Le'omanut Bekibbutz Ein Harod. Mishkan, which means the holy place. Again, think about Bezalel, but also in a kibbutz, which is a secular, collective, rather Bolshevik community. They called their art museum Mishkan, a temple for art. And you can see here Chaim Atar, who was a young pioneer. Him with a group of pioneers left their parents in Europe, came to Israel, early 20s, early 30s. Of course, everything was very very full of idealistic thoughts. They were all very young, very committed to this idea of establishing their own independent place. And Chaim Atar was very close to art. His brother was playing the violin. He himself was engaging plastic art. And he thought, again, I should establish an art museum within my community. You have to understand that when I'm talking about a community, I'm talking about a group of youngsters. It's a very, very small community in the hills with the tents. I mean, it's amazing to think about funds and money and all those obligations of bureaucracy that we have around our museums, our organizations, and they actually had nothing, almost nothing to eat, to wear. And still, it was very important for them to establish this place, this museum, the beginning of this museum. And that only reflects for you the strong implement and understanding how they felt that those institutions, well, it's not an institution, the place, could reflect and symbolize their thoughts, their ambitions, and it's interesting again to see how he fought to start to collect art in such a poor conditions. And today the museum is looking the same as it looks in '48. Shmuel Bikeles was the architect who took the small museum and gave it much bigger and much more established premises, in depending a lot on natural light. Inside of it, you could see that there's a very unique structure that enters the strong natural light, but then graduate it and control it in all kind of different ways. And the atmosphere there is great, and it's still amazing to see this place working, exhibiting, and collaborating, and to think about the struggle that those early pioneers had to go through by establishing in their own community their own museum. And now let's talk a bit about the Herzliya Museum of Contemporary Art. Well, it wasn't always just this cool, progressive contemporary art institution. Actually, the history of Herzliya Museum is also deeply connected with questions of ideology and nationality, although Herzliya is more modified as a bourgeois, comfortable city in the center of Israel. Of course, Herzliya, after Herzl, that's the source of the name, but not that much of a pioneering place, today at least. And you could see here the premises of the museum. You could see that we are talking about a brutalist structure, but the beginning of this museum was established in early 60s in a small apartment in the middle of the city. It was there. The city of Herzliya is a city that is located 20 minutes from Tel Aviv. And by me saying so, you could understand that it's not exactly the main city, but more of a suburban style city. And the city of Herzliya started her museum, as I told you, by the inhabitants initiated their own museum. They wanted it. Again, they felt that the museum would declare their place as an important, cultivated place. And after gaining some funds from the municipality and from the state, they could open a real structure at the year between the years 65 and 75. This construction was held by Yaakov Rechter, the architect, and it was very complex and unnatural structure. And that's another thing that I want to tell you about connecting art, museum, ideology, and nationality in Israel. It's not just an art museum. It's not that the habitant of Herzliya and the city administrators thought that it would be important for us to have a contemporary art museum. They actually wanted to connect between a memorial place and a community art center, cultural center. They thought that we shouldn't build just monuments to remind us about the soldiers or the victims of terror attack that was killed from the family of this city. And they wanted to create this place that will be a commemoration place, but also a live community center. So you can see here the ceremony that launched this unique construction. And actually this unique construction is duplicated, and you could find it on different cities in Israel. And it's really interesting to see that this construction held up and rather in a rather successful way. And you can see here the parents of the families, of the soldiers, of the victims of terror attacks that was killed. They are signing their names, and then they buried it, and this was the foundation stone of our museum. And then the entrance to the museum was through this memorial section it calls Yad Laburnum. Yad, it's hand in Hebrew, but it also comes from a biblical source. It means a memorial place, a memorial for the sons. And so at the beginning, until the year 2000, you would enter the museum, the contemporary Herzliya Art Museum, through this memorial. As you can see, this is a brutalist, abstract, constructivist, abstract work, but you would enter inside, and this is the memorial room. And inside the memorial room, you will have all the names. Yes, the inscriptions, the names of those soldiers. And at the year 2000, the former director of the museum felt that it was too contradicted, those two elements between the contemporary art section of the museum and the memorial section of the museum. And the big donation was received, and a new venue was built, and she completely changed the entrance of the museum, and the two spaces between the memorial section and the contemporary art section were completely divided. And this was the situation until 3.5 years ago, since I entered the museum. I just want to show you, you probably recognize, I was speaking with Malgorzata about the problems that the former director of the Herzliya Museum, Dalia Levin, was actually experiencing. For example, you could see the work of Hugo Randonone, this rainbow over the section, the memorial section, and the families of the soldiers were really very much against and protested against this work, although we all feel that it's beautiful and very much harmonious, stating dreams and dramas, expressing his view on the subject, but they were really felt offended and protest very strongly against it. So they had to, first it was experiencing vandalizing attacks, and then they had to move this sculpture at the end. And then Malgorzata told me that you have more or less the same problematic, something about rainbows. Yes, such a beautiful and peaceful symbol, so charged with hatred and violence. Interesting subject. So as you can see now, we have a new entrance to the Herzliya Museum, and you can see this fantastic monumental sculpture by Yaakov Dorchin at the entrance. This is a melting pot that is more or less symbolizing also our society in a way, in my respect. And as you can probably know, that brutalist style is an international style, and you can see it all over. But as we usually does, Israeli adopted immediately this international style and felt like it was his own, expressing its own need of shelter-like, but also vulnerability, also its modest means of the society, so adopted immediately and called it a local Israeli style. And you can see the new entrance of the museum, and you can see the big hall, also part of the new wing of the museum. But what about the older part? This is the way the old museum was look like, and now you could see how it looks today. And I had, as I told you, when I entered my position 3.5, almost 4 years ago, I was thinking about this separation between the two parts and thinking about the early original thought about constructing this institution, connecting to nationality, to ideology, to the story of the place. It has its own burden, but again, its own hopes, its own expectations. So, should I follow my predecessor directors and to continue to separate the two parts, Or maybe should I challenge the separation? Maybe connecting between contemporary art and all those high ideals, this nationality, ideology, politics, war, could we connect? Could we make a certain dialogue? Well, those are very complicated questions, and I'm sorry, although I feel I'm a very young woman, I couldn't actually answer those questions. So I turned to specialists like we normally do, and I met this artist who's also an architectural investigator, Dr. David Behar Perachia from the Technion in Haifa. He's an architect, and we held this 4 months open live laboratory inside the museum, inspecting the division between the two parts. And you can see that during the live operation of this group of researchers, they actually expose and actually did this excavation process in revealing and reconnecting the two parts. First, just to see, to explore, to ask, to challenge the separation. And later on, maybe we will have some answers, I don't know. And then we invited artists to start to work with the elements that they revealed in the deserted background part, because it was really abandoned through the years. You could imagine after 20 years that this section was completely divided and apart at the museum. No one was actually aware what was there. And we invited artists like Asaf Evron, that he documented and photographed, and invited another artist to comment upon the elements in there, or Dana Yoeli, that investigated these elements. And this is part of an ongoing search and challenge that we are having. And recently, when I sat and talked with David Behar about this issue, he told me, you know, Aya, I was only dealing with the issues of architectural and structures and the idea of connecting between museum and commemoration, but actually there are people there who are related in blood to this place and with open wounds, and I didn't relate to that matter, to that issue. And we are now actually starting to think how we could create a community, that we could start again to think about the connections between the two parts, and maybe to connect them, and maybe to do some activities around them. Another issue, a really strong issue that we had in the Herzliya Museum was, and I think that a lot of contemporary art institutions experiencing, that on one hand it gained a lot of credit in the artistic field, in the Israeli and abroad, but on the other hand the common public was quite removed and withdrawn from the museum. So when I entered this museum, one of my main challenges was how to connect again this museum that was established by the people of the city, for the city, and is actually more than 80% funds by their taxes, how to make it again relevant to their life. And it's a very, very important question on one hand, and on the other hand, like every contemporary art curator and art historian, not to have to popularize our content, not to have to do things that I wouldn't feel completely connected to. So of course engaging a rich program is a doable thing, and is a thing that we are all experiencing with, and those are, you know, those photos that all of us contemporary art curators love to show, how the museum is filled with people, and, you know, they're really interested into it, and of course they are, but it is a struggle. It's an everyday struggle to gain those photos that I'm very proudly showing here to you. but actually our main occupation is dealing with children. We have more than, and in Israeli terms it's a lot, we have 17,000 children every year going through the museum. And it's quite challenging because a lot of people ask why should the children should come to a contemporary art museum. Of course, they all understand why they should go to the Israel Museum, to Encyclopedic Museum, to see ethnograph, to see archaeology, to see prehistoric, and to see old masters and modern masters. But to see contemporary art exhibitions, why should them? It's confusion, it will confuse them, it's difficulty, the contexts sometimes are revolving, so why should they? And this is an ongoing struggle, an ongoing debate that we are having. And also another aspect that we are dealing with is the Orthodox community that is living and part of our country, part of our people, and to connect them to the museum is actually also a challenge that we took, because, as I told you, the easiest way there is to handle a problem is to build a fence, is to block the connection. Think about how blocking the connection between the memorial section and the contemporary art section. Yes, no one will offend the other, no one will interrupt the other, no one will challenge the other. But how could I make the Contemporary Art Museum without any without making any reduction of real content, and to get to those people and to start a dialogue with them? Maybe we could connect, maybe we could open up, maybe we could face problems together. So we constructed a new program for those communities. And also with Arab speakers communities. We are now training Arab speakers students who graduated art schools to become guides, artistic guides at our museum, so they could approach children who speak Arab. So to enlarge the community of children that we are approached to. And you have to understand that we have a lot of criticism from the parents. Why do we need to expose our children to contemporary art content? And we are actually gaining a lot of support from the municipality and from the Ministry of Education, not the ministry, but more the municipality authorities of education, that we should continue challenging the young generation and not only protecting them, bringing to their attention only controlled child-oriented content. And I really, really appreciate their openness and their trust in our professionalism, because we are really, really putting a lot of efforts to create this dialogue. And another important thing that we started to do 3.5 years ago, and of course, you know that a museum, although I showed you those crazy personas like Boris Schatz or Chaim Attar, those crazy profitive curatorial manager who established their museum. A museum is an operation of a group of people, and not only of the employers, but also the community is a very important part for the success and the relevance of the museum. And I believe that not only the municipality and national establishment should support our museum financially, but also the people of the place themselves. So we launched a group of Friends of the Museum. It's not a wealthy, very high-profile organization, but I feel that even if they donate like 500 zloty or 400 zloty, it makes them involved and part of this organization, and each part has its own responsibility and involvement in this institution, and actually involved personally in the maintenance of this institution. So by opening up, also each one of these three groups is balancing each other. No one could take over this delicate structure of a contemporary art museum. Not the municipality, not the Ministry of Culture, and not the people who belongs to the group of supporters, the Friends of the Museum. All of them having their part, but no one could overcome another part, because each one has a mandate, a financial mandate to maintain the professional, non-profit, educational, cultural, artistic acknowledgement of the place. And it seems that to be a director of a contemporary art museum, you should actually become more of a politician or a diplomat than an art historian. But I have to tell you that those challenges are really fascinating, because also they're reflecting our times today. And I feel that I can't just have the luxury of being an inner discourse, sophisticated, although I am an institution, but I also have a responsibility to understand and to listen and to be open up to all kind of mixed thoughts, views, and criticism upon this construction. And I just want to show you in a very few words towards the end. You were so patient to listen to all this heavy stuff. And this is a new project. It's actually a dream that I hope we will fulfill. It's a suggestion made by an Israeli architect, Eran Chen, who operates in Manhattan. And he was our guest at the Herzliya Museum of Contemporary Art, and we have this, as I showed you, a fantastic grounds with sculptures and everything. And I showed him all this community work that we are now doing outside the museum, all those happenings and in holidays. And then he wrote me back and said, I felt so connected to the place, and I want to donate as a pro bono this project. And this project will be something like that could remind you what they're doing at the Serpentine, for example. It's an architectural element, which is also an independent sculpture, but it also contains, you see, also contain the iconic value of Herzliya, of our city. It's a wave because Herzliya is located just on the seashore. A certain kind of a stone, which is limestone. This is the stone of Herzliya, full of holes. So he used a concrete element, light element that will remind this stone and will remind the sea wave, and it will give us the most important thing that we need, shade. So under this shady element, we could actually gather around and make a place for a communal meeting. It will have elements of greenery that will grow through this element, and also some sound sensors that you could pass through and then hear the ocean or hear the local whistling that you have, all kind of artistic elements that will be intertwined and changed through this thing. And you could see that all kind of artistic activities could be held and perform under this element. So this is our new ambitious project, and you could see that from focusing inside the construction, dealing with art, artists, contemporary art challenges that are so very important to us, But at the same time, we are struggling also to be relevant to the community, to the city, and also to offer them a curatorial look upon their life and the way that we can combine them together. So thank you so much for being so patient and listening to me. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Thank you very much for that lecture and presentation. And I open the Q&A. So if you have a question, comment, please raise your hands, and I will come to you with a microphone.
You mentioned briefly that Herzliya Art Museum is funded by the city by 80%. Is there any state funding for these 4 museums that you mentioned in Harod, Israel Museum, Herzliya, and Tel Aviv Museum of Arts?
Yes, all of us are recognized museums, and we gain funds from the Ministry of Culture as well. Unfortunately, there are small funds, but too small. But yes, we gain them.
Is it also funds for collections, or are these museums?
Oh, it's a very difficult question because the funds are so modest. So we are, of course, purchasing art, but not enough, and not in the portion that I feel that we should. So we use them to buy art, but not as much as we should, as I believe we should.
I also have a question because, challenging the criticality of contemporary art institution is something very much different in Israeli, given social, economical, political, and any kind of conditions, that in Polish ones, and so on. So, and I remember visiting your museum 1 month ago and seeing a series of very interesting figurative painting shows, and you were explaining me 2 things, that some of the painters, they were self-trained painters, some of them of non-Jewish but Israeli origin, and that there is a kind of a figurative turn in Israeli contemporary painting, which is a very strong, a critical gesture. If you could elaborate a little bit on that, because I find it really interesting and really very much different tool of thinking of contemporary art and its institution as a tool for criticality. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the ways of bringing the audience be involved in contemporary issues is actually to show them how contemporary artistic issues are connected to social, economical thing that we are experiencing in Israeli society today, because the gaps are not that far. And if you're reading the newspapers or see the news on the television or in your iPhone, you would actually be able to connect it to the art. And we have lately this big and strong discussion about the political identity of our society, because as I showed you, it was ratherly in unnatural way accumulated and being constructed as a unified society. So in the past few years, in the past years, the political of each group, identity, differentiation, nature is actually challenging the mainstream narrative of Israeli society. So what I was demonstrating through the exhibition that you experienced, well, most of the artists there came from Oriental origin, from Tehran, from South African origin or thought, In a way, those voices are challenging the mainstream also tendencies in contemporary art, using figurative art, spectrum, very colorful. It's like a statement against elite, a minimalist conceptual heritage. But yet again, it's not only an outsider attitude, it's actually a protest against the mainstream modernist, European modernist attitude. So in a way, it's very much connected to what happens today in literature, in poetry, also in Oriental pop culture that is really very dominant now, and it reflects its way to plastic art as well. And I think that another important issue that made bridge between us and the public is not only to focus on inner mediumal discourses, but to open up our subject to contemporary economical, technological, scientific subject, that people that are coming from other fields of knowledge could connect it and could understand, even though they don't have a first or second degree in art history or philosophy or critical cultural critical discourses. So they could connect, they could actually relate to, and they won't feel like being abandoned somewhere between Picasso and Renoir. More questions?
Yes.
And how do you see the art galleries landscape scene? The private galleries, are they growing, or they make for museums interesting tensions with maybe international exchange? How do you see it? Because from time to time we know, like Dvir Gallery, and they have its branch in Brussels, etc., etc. But how do you see it? Sometimes making for you faster approach to some artists. Do you see it as a enriching at the moment? It's my question. How do you feel with it?
First, we are having a very deep crisis in contemporary art market in Israel. I don't really deal with the market or more commercial side of art, but a lot of galleries are being closed, and more different kind of collective construction is being opened, organized by artists, for artists, organized and occupied by artists. And of course, they all blaming the big art fairs that took over the scenery and put in those mega artists that has nothing to do with proportion, finance proportion to the actual artistic value, if I could say artistic value nowadays. A lot of art galleries in Israel are being closed. It's a problem. A lot of them, I mean, those who did survive opened branches abroad to have this bridge, this connection. And as you mentioned, Dvir Gallery, we're now exhibiting Miri Segal, one of the prominent artists of this gallery, in our museum. And of course, we are collaborating as much as we can. Everybody is a partner, as I told you. Everybody is a partner, but the partners that we are collaborating with must know our limits, our values, and that's the way that we can collaborate with them. And we have to respect each other's boundaries and each other's expectations, and that's the only way to work with. I'm sure that you're experiencing the same struggle with the financing of of the field, but it's a thing that I think that shouldn't actually matter, because when I'm looking backwards, I could see the means and the efforts that the pioneering ones did, and I feel that we are dealing with a much more meaningful elements. We are talking about meaning, we're talking about culture, we're talking about spirit, we're talking about symbols, and I have a lot of responsibility to those huge words, and actually half of me is very cynical and very critical towards them, but half of me is actually thinking that what kind of humanity we will have without those words. So,
is there any other question from the public? Because I have one actually,
yes.
if I may, last but not least. You said in the nowadays you focus on working with the community and the local community and creating the bond, or even the new sense of knowledge and connection with a community. So my question is. Actually, two, how you will describe with your experience the impact of the museum, Herzliya Museum, at the community? And this is the one question. And another one is, what is the feedback from the community of the new policy or new politics of Herzliya Museum?
Okay, so you know, our art field, like every field, has its fashionable words, and now community, operating with communities is a strong thing. Yeah, we could eventually give something and then show actual doing. And of course, I'm very critical also to this element, and thinking about a practical use of museum, okay, but actually, I could feel that in a very, very slow process, I'm not giving a certain ideology. I'm not a preacher. What I can offer is to see that we are all inside a certain box, and I'm offering a new concept, a new way of showing the boundaries of our conceptual being constructed in a conceptual boundaries way, and I think that's the only thing that I could actually offer. To see that I have limitations driven by my education, my culture, my religion, my gender, all of this. I have all kind of boxes inside of me, and actually, what I feel that artist could offer for us is a reflection of it, and maybe to reflect something outside those boxes. And in a way, I felt that those brave families who participate in our workshops, in our creative operations together, in a way are open up themselves to those kind of challenges, to those kind of new conceptions. And it's a process, it's a long process, it's a difficult process. But I have to tell you that the mayor of Herzliya, his name is Moshe Fadlon, and he's a person that wasn't really educated in the regular, I don't know, academic system, and really was a bit against our museum at first. He said, I never visited the museum before. And then he actually started to visit and to be part of, and I invited him from the minute I entered the museum to participate the openings and to greet the visitors. And you know, actually he got to really understand what an important system and what is the strength of the museum, what it could offer him. And maybe, of course, for you, you are a very educated professional audience, but it's not a common knowledge to a lot of people, the importance of a museum, of art museum in a community. Why should they keep it? Why should they invest in it? They could open schools or other institutions that could gain them much more voters and much more political. And suddenly he became more and more involved and seeing the children there. And through the children, I got to his heart. And now I have to tell you that he's one of the big supporters of our museum. And it's not just on a propaganda way, but he actually feels that this place could give those children something else. He doesn't really know to indicate what it is, but it's something else outside the everyday chores and formal education, something else. And that intrigues him and really caught him. And actually, I'm really proud about this dialogue with him.
Thank you very much for the reply. Last chance, I guess, to ask a question. If you have second thoughts or comments, please don't hesitate. But if not, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and lecture once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the participation and have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Konrad.
Dziękuję.